Welcome everyone to episode 10 of the E-Talk Show featuring Don, Brett, and Shri. And today we address the kryptonite of CPG. Yeah, man, the kryptonite of CPG. It is that big. It's the phenomenon called D2C or direct to consumer. What I've observed over the last 10 years or so is, the in-store business model had a stronghold over retail traditionally. And it was very hard for Kickstarter brands, startup brands to find their footholding within the store because the in-store business is growing average at 3% the last decade or so. Largely distribution gains, new store openings, things of that nature. And traditionally the domain of large brands. But Amazon opened up the umbrella, I would say, with demonstrating to Kickstarter brands that anybody can sell their product to a consumer who's seeking product anywhere, anytime, at any place. Right. And today I see hundreds of CPG brands that are actually in the D2C space, some amazing ones that now are giving a run for its money to large CPG brands with this thing, and hence I call it the kryptonite of large brands, direct to consumer. So I'd love to know from you, Don, what are some D2C brands you admire and who's really getting this right? What have you encountered in this journey for D2C brands?
Great question. Many of these folks, you and I know many of these folks that run several of these companies. But with that being said, I look at and I admire brands like RX Bar. I admire brands like Casper, like Warby Parker, what they've done, like Dollar Shave Club. Those are some fascinating examples that we look at of brands that scale within a matter of less than three years, and they do it, they scale in a meaningful, disruptive way. So those are some of the examples I think of.
I mean, those are some elite, amazing brands that I feel like consumers relate one-on-one with. But one of the things that's popping up in my head I'd love to address is these brands, what are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? What's made them elite? And I really feel that in 2019, large brands, large CPG companies should take D2C very seriously. Absolutely. I mean, is it the exact same formula as the 1P business they run in a pure play? Probably not, because they're going to be, for the first time, they may actually become a retailer in the first place. But I feel that in 2019, unless you have some sort of a D2C ecosystem, doing trial and test and learns with new innovation, things of that nature, they're just going to get harder and harder to get shelf space in the in-store business model for scale. And when you list it online, in earlier episodes down, we've talked about AMS and how difficult it's getting harder and harder to win the search battle. I remember you saying you got to be on the first page, you got to be in the first 3 or 5 in the search rankings. So I feel that in 2019, if you're a large brand, you gotta have a D2C play of some sort.
I would agree, and I think you have to have a strong, significant D2C play, and you have to rank. You have to ensure that page ranks within search. But then also, and if not more importantly, you have to make sure there's a commerce hook associated with D2C. And this made up example of if a brand 2 years ago had just items on their site that they just featured with not optimized content, not optimized imagery, and really there was no commerce stuff. It was just go browse for some inspiration. I think those days are long gone. And if you were in the razor category, I'm sure the Dollar Shave Club team loved that. If you were in the mattress category, I'm sure that the Casper team just loved that. I think times changed, and they're not going to change. They did change, and brands have to respond.
So one of the things that, I'm sure viewers would love to just learn is, if you are a legacy brand, so you're a scale brand, a large part of your business is in store, you're already listed on 1P pure play, you're working on 3P, and then you get into this, what would be the best way to launch something on D2C? On day one, do you get into social vehicles to promote it? Do you only do mobile first? And even within mobile, there's apps, there's like rendering on a phone, on a smartphone. What would be the best way to get your brand out there for D2C and kind of communicate to a consumer, I'm there, take a look at me?
That's a great point. I think this is where a lot of brands struggle, and a lot of agencies struggle to give brands advice because some of the agencies don't really know themselves yet. because it's evolving. But I would say that probably more important than anything, I think it's important to go wherever consumers are going for your products and go target those consumers. So if they're on Instagram, you need in your space, you need to be on Instagram in a big, meaningful way. If your consumers in your category is not on Instagram, they're on another social platform. If it's a business to business product, you should be on LinkedIn. You've got to go where those consumers are, because you don't have the backbone and the architecture of a brick and mortar to just broadly, distribute your message of, hey, new product, front of store, end cap, etc. Your brand has to deploy assets disproportionately to where the consumers are, fully knowing that's different, drastically different than what most CMOs would be comfortable with today, specifically with a launch of a new item or a product, which they would typically favor more towards what's safe.
So can you demystify this influencer theory for D2C? Because I too, when I'm on Instagram, see a ton of new products that influencers are pushing.
Absolutely. I think it's no different than the influencer community, is no different than the social proof associated with reviews on Amazon, and how important, as we talk to some of our friends in the industry, we talked to Danny Silverman a good bit from Edge Essential, and we talk about the basics with Digital Shelf, and we talk about ratings and reviews. It's the same basics, but employed in a different avenue. And I think with the generations coming up behind us, it's very, very important to ensure you're putting your brand in a position to be seen. And in order to do that, you have to put your brand where the eyeballs are at. And knowing that is likely different than what most brands' media allocations have laid out today.
Just going back to D2C, we've talked about media and the importance of Instagram and influencers seems like one of the best ways to launch your brand publicly. We talked about how the reason you also get into D2C is because launching innovation, there's a possibility that may be the best way to launch innovation in the future. I want to talk about what are some of the reasons a brand would get into D2C, like data, CRM. This is a word that keeps turning its head in the industry, and a lot of people, especially strategists, tell me those are two reasons to get into D2C. So can you tell us more about what is this data and CRM, and what would someone be seeking in those spaces with D2C?
Sure. I think, you and I both have grown up in multi-billion-dollar CPG brands. And when we look at consumer research, the typical kind of segmentation of consumers, she's Joe or she's Sally or he's Joe, and he has this much income or she has this much income, and here are her preferences. But that was years ago. But I think many brands are hanging on to that today. And what we think about with D2C, you get the ability to know exactly who your consumers are. You get to know exactly what they like and what they dislike, what their income thresholds are, and you can really speak to your consumer in a meaningful way with a much higher conversion than you could years ago. So one of the great benefits of truly scaling D2C in a meaningful way is really understanding your customer, your consumer, which allows you to further develop have the product pipeline behind that developed, optimized for truly what that consumer wants and desires, which I think allows sustainable long-term growth.
Kind of results in another question, which is, can you take any SKU that you make or every SKU that you make and launch it via D2C? Would that be the right, responsible thing to do, or no?
Great question, Sri. I don't think it's a strategy where you fully deploy your assortment across the broad marketplace. It's a more acute, focused, prescriptive strategy that allows D2C to showcase your more premium end of your range, allows you to speak to the consumer in a more meaningful and deep way that truly allows a connection with the brand. I think it's part of a channel strategy that many brands in their AOP processes need to incorporate. D2C is not, to your point, it's not a tactic that's deployed where the full range gets listed out. It is a it is a more thoughtful, again, more acute strategy that's deployed, and I would say most effectively in my experience with personally and working with brands on the higher end of the premium range.
So one of the things, I hear you say premium range, and I'm thinking to myself, one of the things I hear a lot in the industry is D2C is P&L accretive. It's not accretive. I'm sorry, it's decretive. If there was such a word, right? So if you're a large legacy brand, why would you even get into D2C if it's actually going to hurt your value proposition within the company for a given brand? I mean, but on the other hand, I hear you say it's non-negotiable. So kind of explain, what does a large legacy brand do in that situation?
Sure. I think some statistics that come to mind, the e-commerce is currently approximately 10% of sales in the United States. And that is expected to continue to evolve to 12, 15, 20%. So consumers are moving more and more online. Amazon is the starting point for search of products in the most recent study that we've seen published in our community, over 70% of product searches. Amazon accounts for over 50% of the e-commerce sales today. It is blindly naive, in my perspective, to not have a DTC strategy which will allow you to truly understand your consumer, who he or she is, what he or she prefers, the ways that he or she prefers to be communicated to. Because if you do not have a DTC strategy thought out, in my opinion, as the landscape continues to shift, you'll get further and further behind, and it'll be very, very challenging to catch up, if not very expensive.
Blindly naive, as coined by our resident e-commerce expert here, Mr. Don Brett himself. Yeah. And I guess that's why we call it the kryptonite of legacy brands, right? Of large brands. So in closing here, as we round up this episode on direct to consumer, also known as the kryptonite of consumer packaged goods. So guys, thank you, Don. That was, I think, a good discussion we just had on the kryptonite of CPG, direct, also known as, you heard it from the man and me, kryptonite of CPG.
There you go.
Direct to consumer.
So do not be blindly naive.
Thanks,
I'll let you close it out.
Of course, yeah. We'll see you guys back again next week for another episode of the E-Talk with Don and Brett. See you next Monday.